My name is Daniel Olsen, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography. And today I'd like to present a little bit on how COVID has affected the way that geographers study pilgrimage. I understand, along with my colleagues for this particular panel session, that the focus is more on individually as an academic, how has COVID affected my research on pilgrimage? We wanted to expand this a little bit more, talking about our own disciplines and how COVID has affected the work of our colleagues in the study of pilgrimage. As a geographer, I want to talk more about geography and some of the issues that have arisen, how geographers have been limited in the way that we can study our passion, which is pilgrimage. To start off, I just want to talk a little bit, if I could, about geography, what it is, and how geographers study the world. I then want to talk about the geography of pilgrimage and what type of themes and research themes geographers have studied when they look at pilgrimage. I then want to talk a little bit more about some of the difficulties that have arisen as geographers have tried to study pilgrimage travel in the context of COVID-19 before I conclude and talk about maybe what's going to happen in the future post-COVID once everyone gets their vaccine shots. So geography, the actual word is derived from a Greek word, geographin, which means writing about the world. Geo meaning world and graphin meaning to write. Therefore, geographers are sometimes called earth describers. We travel around the world, we describe the things that we see, both the similarities between where we are from and where we are traveling to, and also the differences between those places and where we live. The term geography is also known as a spatial science. The word spatial is an adjective, which means of, relating to, involving, or having the nature of space. So we are interested as geographers in anything that deals with space. Now, there are many more specific definitions of geography that have been offered by geography scholars, but the one that I like the most is one by Richard Hartshorne in 1959, where he said that geography is concerned with providing an accurate, orderly, and rational description and interpretation of the variable character of the Earth's surface. The reason why I like this definition is because the terms accurate, orderly, and rational suggest that geography is a science. We do follow the scientific method. We want to ask questions and gather and analyze data and to find answers to our questions in a way that's accurate, orderly, and rational, like other scientists do, whether physical or social scientists. We not only describe the similarities and differences that we see across the surface of the Earth, but we also interpret. We try to figure out why we see what we see, why we see these particular patterns. Are they good patterns or bad patterns? And what can we do about them if they are bad patterns? We also understand that the character of the Earth's surface is variable, that there's going to be a lot of difference. And so a lot of geographers focus more so on difference than we do similarities. We also are interested in the Earth's surface or Earth space, what happens between human interactions and human nature interactions across the surface of the Earth, and also what happens a little bit above the surface of the Earth, what happens a little bit below. We do that because what happens below and above the surface of the Earth affects those human nature relationships along the Earth's surface. So geography is really a discipline that is interested with features in and human uses of Earth space. And again, human nature interactions in that area. Geography is sometimes called a synthesizing discipline because we study space and place. And all disciplines, no matter what they study, whether they are economists or nuclear physicists, everything they study is in space and located somewhere in a place. And because of that, geography is sometimes called the synthesizing discipline, where we can bring people from seemingly disparate disciplines together to have conversations. But because everything has space and place, geography is sometimes considered a taken for granted discipline. Yeah, what I study, space, place, that all makes sense. So we don't really think geography is being important because it's kind of been naturalized in our thinking until probably about the present day. Anyone who's watching this video who has seen or gone to the Johns Hopkins University COVID-19 dashboard will get a general sense of the importance of geography, where we're looking in this particular case, we can look over time, not just where COVID is influencing populations, but also the spread of COVID as well. In fact, that's one article here suggests that amid a pandemic, geography returns with a vengeance because, as it says here, the coronavirus is forcing us to reconsider physical space and our place within it. The thing about COVID is that it's not transmitted through robots. It's not transmitted through technology. It's transmitted through face-to-face human interactions, as well as engaging in spaces where humans that might have had COVID used to be. And then people become vectors or the spreaders of COVID-19. So it really hits home the idea of who do we interact with? Who do we want to interact with? Where do I want to go? Where do I want to avoid? So all of a sudden, this idea of personal space in relationship to the space of other people and other places becomes really important. As Eric Steiner has suggested, real world proximity has been receding gradually from our consciousness. But thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, it throws into perspective the importance of space in our own personal lives. Another thing to mention really quickly about geography is that it's a pretty eclectic discipline. We usually divide geography into three sections. We have those that focus on human-human relationships across the Earth's surface. We have the physical geographers that deal with nature issues and also human nature interactions. And then we have those that deal with geographic techniques that look at how we gather and analyze data to answer our questions. The thing about geography, though, is that because we study so much, there's no disciplinary boundary on what we can and cannot study, is that we tend to be, again, interdisciplinary. As someone that studies pilgrimage and religious tourism, I spend more time talking to people in anthropology and sociology and religious studies than I ever would talking to a geographer that specializes in geographical techniques or specializes in physical geography. The thing to note, though, about geography is that geography is more than just making maps. It's more than just memorizing place names. It's more than being the person everyone wants on your Trivial Pursuit team. We also talk about space and place and time and distance and scale, nature, landscape, systems, globalization, risk, development, sustainability, relevance, and mobilities, among other things. We are very eclectic in what we do as geographers and study a whole host of things. One of the things that geographers do study is pilgrimage in the geography of religion. We know that at a very basic level, pilgrimage is a geographical phenomenon. It's about the movement of someone from point B across the Earth's surface to point B, at least from a structural sense. So, and then of course, that movement would be back from B towards A, returning home again. Pilgrimage has historically been a physical journey where people literally get up and move their bodies across Earth space to a site that they hold to be sacred, to perform rituals or to pray or whatever their motivations might be, to travel to a place that they consider to be sacred or religious. Now, today, there's been a lot of talk about virtual pilgrimage, but at the same time, it still requires mental exertion. You're taking your mind and the emotions that come with that across space to a place that is located somewhere else. But again, historically, pilgrimage implies some sort of physical movement. And anytime you have someone going from point A to point B across the surface of the Earth, or if they're flying right above the surface of the Earth, there are going to be some positive and some negative economic, sociocultural, and environmental impacts that arise. And that has been one of the mainstays of the geography of pilgrimage. And I guess related to that, religious tourism, a lot of people have talked about those positive and negative impacts that arise. A lot of geographers have also talked about the relationships between pilgrimage and modern tourism. Is pilgrimage a form of tourism today, or pilgrimage and tourism separate types of travel? Are pilgrims and tourists the same? Can tourists have the same experiences as pilgrims do when they travel and seek similar authentic experiences? I have recently published a book chapter looking more at pilgrimage and its ties with modern mass tourism, especially in the context of disease and mass religious gatherings. So, for example, here on the screen, the upper left-hand box, we're looking at the Kumbh Mela in India. On the right, we're looking at the pilgrimage for the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico. Bottom left, we're looking at the beginnings of the Hajj. In the bottom right, we're looking at Pope Francis, who's traveled to Fatima to worship, and hundreds of thousands of people, knowing the Pope would be there, also show up at Fatima as well. You would look at these images in the middle of a pandemic and say, this is probably not the type of pilgrimage that people should be engaging in, at least not with the numbers of people that we are seeing here. And so, but some of the largest gatherings in the world, human gatherings in the world, are religious in nature through the medium of pilgrimage. So what are some of the things that geographers study in the context of pilgrimage? I just have a few selected research themes here just to give you a sense of what geographers do. Geographers study the creation, the maintenance, and the management of sacred sites and landscapes. Geographers study contested sacred space and also topophilia, or the love of place, and how place attachment ties into this context of religious travel. Geographers study pilgrimage at different scales of analysis. Geographers look at the increasing mobility of people across the surface of the earth, and again, look at the positive and negative economic, sociocultural, and environmental impacts. Geographers also look at sensuous, embodied, and gendered experiences within sacred spaces and how that leads to the formation of religious and secular identities as well. Geographers also look at globalization, secularization, and post-secularization, and how all of this over time has affected the way that we understand and view pilgrimage and how pilgrimage has developed over this same time span. So what happens to this geography of pilgrimage and the study of pilgrimage when we are in an era of COVID? It's really difficult at many levels to study pilgrimage when no one is going on a pilgrimage. We have lockdowns, we have travel bans. This actually brings up the importance of the political economy of pilgrimage, which Coleman and Eade in 2018 actually edited a book on, an anthropologist and a sociologist, if I recall correctly, their disciplinary backgrounds. Geographers also study political economy, and this is something that probably geographers are studying more of in this particular context, because the importance of political institutions, in this case, limiting pilgrimage, which is a really important part of the economy in many regions of the world. This raises the question, though, how can geographers write about the world if they can't actually be in the world, can't be circulating around the world, describing what they see and interpreting the patterns that they observe as well? It brings up another question to me. What effect does COVID have on present and the future geographic research on pilgrimage? Well, let me suggest a few ways in which COVID-19 has affected and will affect into the future the way that geographers study pilgrimage. First of all, one of the things that a lot of geographers write about in the context of pilgrimage is they focus on the big, popular international sites that receive hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people a year. What we're going to find, though, is that international movement is becoming more limited. And even after the vaccine is given, probably will be limited at some level. I'll mention that in just a couple of minutes here. We're going to see a descaling of pilgrimage research, where we're going to see more geographers focus on local and regional and more domestic pilgrimage centers rather than international centers, in part because it might be more difficult for pilgrims to travel internationally, but also more difficult to researchers, geographers, to travel internationally as well. I think there's going to be some more research on the geographies of worship, as it has been called, in part how technology has changed religious rituals and the need to travel long distances to perform those rituals. We're probably going to end up seeing the creation of new localized sacred spaces. What sometimes happens is that when an immigrant group travels and migrates to a new world region, they tend to mimic or replicate their sacred sites. If a group can't travel back because of COVID or other pandemics or because of government intervention, we might begin to see the replica of more religious sites around the world as a new phenomenon. With the pictures I showed you earlier of these mass religious events, it raises questions in the minds of geographers about sustainability and whether you can be environmentally sustainable with millions of people traveling to a particular religious site or for a particular religious event. And so that's going to probably be a new emphasis. It's Kieran Shindy, for example, a colleague of mine out of Australia, has done a lot of research in this area. We just published a book on this topic. And I think bioconservation is going to be a big issue when it comes to pilgrimage and sustainability in the near future. How are pilgrimage rituals going to change because of COVID? So if you used to touch things, if you used to kiss things, if you used to have these different smells in the air, all of that might begin to change because of the spread of COVID or other diseases. We may be more mindful in the future about personal space in the context of religious travel. one thing that some geographers are looking at right now, and others in other aligned disciplines and fields of research, is how pilgrims have negotiated the lack of mobility. How are they trying to have pilgrimage experiences when they can't go to the places where those experiences are supposed to be had? For example, you can get an app where you can walk at home 3 or 4 miles a day, let's say, and then it will trace for you your starting point in the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, how far you've walked, and eventually over time you could have walked the Camino, but you're doing it at home instead, and then you get that sense of accomplishment. One thing that I think when I think about pilgrimage research is that it tends to be a little atheoretical. We're focused on people's experiences, but we don't really have a theoretical framework that kind of defines pilgrimage and the boundaries of what pilgrimage is and what it is not. It might be a good thing for some, but not a good thing for others. In a time when we can't actually travel and necessarily gather data, it might be time to sit back and think more about the theoretical aspects of pilgrimage. Maybe do what we've seen is a proliferation, at least in the tourism literature, of different niche markets, and trying to summarize what's been done in the past, what are the ways forward. I expect to see this happening in the geography of pilgrimage and religious tourism literature as well. Is travel really necessary to have pilgrimage experiences? It goes back to the first point a little bit, but how important is travel today? Does there have to be geographical mobility or movement for you to have religious experiences, the same type that you would have being in a location? What have been some of the economic impacts of shutting down pilgrimage sites? This is something that geographers of pilgrimage have talked about, but this will become more of an important issue because of the steep decline in visitation because of COVID. How will governments deal with the mass religious pilgrimage events? How will this affect, for example, what we might call the medicalization of religious pilgrimage and ritual, where government officials come in and say, or health officials come in and say, religious leaders, you can't do certain things at your site because of the potential spread of disease. So how will the management of sacred sites change post-COVID? What type of new methodological tools are we going to be using? For example, I know some of my colleagues in other disciplines, as well as geographers, are now using podcasts to bring in people to talk about experiences. And so that is one way of actually gathering data. We have Zoom meetings now that we can use, and other technologies to reach out to pilgrims to ask about experiences during COVID, and now later on post-COVID. We can also reach out to site managers to talk about some of the issues and problems that are arising as they are trying to deal with the economic and social ramifications of lack of pilgrims coming to their destinations. So in conclusion, I just want to leave with a couple of questions. First of all, will COVID have a lasting impact on how geographers study pilgrimages? I think this will be the case, but it will depend upon if or how pilgrimage travel and rituals change due to the medicalization of travel and due to the use of virtual technologies that may or may not become more commonplace when it comes to performing religious rituals. In addition, it's also going to depend upon how religious pilgrimages, particularly mass religious pilgrimages and events, are affected by what we call the new normal. Many scholars are calling for a new normal when it comes to mobilities, and tourism in particular calls to limit international travel because it's not very sustainable for the environment. If this happens, what happens to international forms of pilgrimage? And in other cases, pilgrims, not just tourists, are also viewed as potential viral sectors or carriers of disease. So does this mean that different countries will start limiting the number of pilgrims that can come to worship at different times of the year? I wonder, though, if COVID is kind of a watershed moment for us. If much of the future research, at least for the next 5 or 10 years, is going to be, well, what happened to pilgrimage prior to COVID, during COVID, and now after COVID? And so it becomes kind of a compare and contrast type of research that we do to see if what was happening before COVID and what's happening over COVID, if one was better than the other, so on and so forth. That's all the thoughts I have at this particular moment, and I'm well out of time, I'm sure. But thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I look forward to meeting with many of you next week to talk in person over Zoom about maybe some of my own personal views or issues that I've seen happen with my research during COVID. But this should give you a general overview of how geographers study pilgrimage and some of the issues that have arisen and will arise as we continue to study this topic that we are passionate about. Thank you very much for your time today.